in saying to Ukraine in 2008, you can become a member of NATO along with Georgia.
That has set the Chinese plan backwards.
As far as limited, people forget he was elected on a peace program.
Post-Cold War era didn't work out for Russia the way that he had envisioned it.
Beyond what we're doing would inevitably lead to World War III. It's just a myth. There's no evidence that supports that.
Two things. We missed our own naivety in saying to Ukraine in 2008, you can become a member of NATO along with Georgia, and then doing nothing to make that a reality. It's a little bit like a cartoon I once saw in the New Yorker magazine of a guy on the phone saying, no, I can't do Thursday. How about never? Could you do never? And that's essentially what we said to Ukraine. And that left them in the worst possible position, aspiring to be part of the West, and yet really having no prospects of becoming protected by NATO. The other thing we missed was, of course, that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, is perfectly capable of using military force to achieve political ends because he's done it repeatedly. He did it against Georgia in 2008. He did it against Ukraine in 2014. He did it in Syria in 2015. He has form, and we should not have been surprised when he invaded, because he had been threatening to do this for many months. I predicted on January the 2nd that he was going to invade, that war was coming to Europe. But people in Western capitals, including President Biden, simply failed to believe that this was possible in 2022. So I think that was the thing that we missed, and we failed to deter him. We altogether failed to deter him with sanctions.
I'm very sympathetic with President Biden and his team's desire to avoid a direct military confrontation between the United States, between a NATO country, and the Russians. But because of this strong desire to avoid direct military confrontation, the impact has been that President Biden is incredibly risk averse in general. And this idea, I thought it was very revealing when President Biden tweeted out and he said that there would be no, U.S. The United States would not fight a war with Russia in Ukraine because that would end up being World War III. That idea that anything that the United States might do to escalate in any way beyond what we're doing would inevitably lead to World War III is just a myth. There's no evidence that supports that. But if you believe that and you internalize that, you self-deter. And when we talk about in crisis management, that the country in a very serious, intense crisis, the country that is willing to escalate is the country that's going to pocket the gains. I mean, it seems obvious when you say it that way, but the effect of the way President Biden has responded to this is every time a Biden official comes out and says we're not going to provide real-time targeting, we're not going to provide ISR to the Ukrainians in this particular scenario, because then the Russians might accuse us as being of co-belligerent. So we're not going to do it because that could be provocative. They say that, or they say we're not going to do a no-fly zone. We're not going to allow the Poles to send in their MiG fighter jets. We're not going to do all of these things. And every time they've done that, the Russians have not responded by de-escalating, which of course is the intent. The Russians respond by escalating. They increase the number of things they're willing to target. They increase the humanitarian suffering. They increase their nuclear saber rattling. They don't decrease their nuclear saber rattling. And so it's almost as if, not even almost, I do suspect, unfortunately, that the Biden administration's response to the Russian nuclear saber rattling really has confirmed exactly the assumptions that the Russians are operating on, which is that we are so terrified of the Russians crossing that nuclear threshold that it paralyzes us to a degree that we don't do things that I think are perfectly reasonable and still at the lower levels of escalation where we could really truly be helping the Ukrainians again have this ultimate kind of strategic victory where they can they can make it so difficult. That the Russians finally do look for an off-ramp and some kind of solution.
There's a lot that's admirable about Zelensky, but of course, Ukraine is to say it's not some paradise. It's a country more dominated by oligarchs, probably, than Russia, and if anything, even more corrupt than Russia. Zelensky's power is limited. People forget he was elected on a peace program. He said he was going to seek peace over because war, by the time he was elected, had been going on for 5 years in the Don Basin. And he wanted, quite rightly, to end it. And he pursued the Minsk talks, which could have ended it if Ukraine had been committed to them, in my view. And he was prevented from doing so by opposition within his own armed forces. And part of that opposition came from the sort of Azov battalion right sector direction, which everyone now likes to pretend isn't important. But it is important, just as the whole problem in the East and in Crimea had a lot to do with the Ukrainian state's language policy, which many Russians regarded as heavily discriminatory against them. And these have a lot to do with the mess that we're now in.
Well, I think Putin feels that the post-Cold War era didn't work out for Russia the way that he had envisioned it. And by that, he means that he does not have the wherewithal to be on the same stage as superpowers like the United States and China. And he thinks he could be, should he reclaim most or much of the 100 million people he lost in population when the Soviet Union evaporated, and the 30% of the territory. And when he looks at the map, he sees Ukraine. It's rich in natural gas. It has precious metals. It's got Europe's most fertile farmland. And he thinks that this is central to these irredentist plans to reclaim, as you said, this sort of Russian empire. And how that goes about, he looks at Georgia, or he looks at Eastern Ukraine or Crimea. And the degree to which he acts immediately is predicated on the status in the West. And the status in the West, and that includes Japan and Australia, South Korea, as well as the EU, NATO, and the United States and Canada. It depends on whether the world price of oil is high and he's rich in petrodollars and we're paying out the nose for energy that we can't or won't produce ourselves. It depends on whether NATO is at each other's throats or they're following the German lead of not meeting their defense obligations to spend 2% of their budgets on military readiness, or Germany is conducting something like this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and also the American president. If the American president is begging Putin to pump more oil when he won't, or when he's asking him to lay off 16 entities when the Russian hackers are disrupting a pipeline in America, as they did in January, but he's begging him not to stop, or forcing him not to stop, but just divert a little bit his attention to other entities. When you have that situation falling in Afghanistan, then he feels opportunistic, and he feels the West either can't or spent or won't defend its own interests, so I'm going to go into Ukraine. I think in this particular instance, what's fooled him is that he didn't count on the response because of these things I talked about. But it was so embarrassing to NATO and the United States and the West that he so flagrantly went in to kill people and wreck that country. He didn't use the full force, the full wherewithal that was at his disposal. For the first 4 or 5 days, he's been shocked. He's been shocked at the Ukrainian resistance. He's been shocked that NATO is now talking more like Winston Churchill than Neville Chamberlain. The German chancellor gave a stunning speech that he basically repudiated everything that Germany has stood for 30 years. You know, we're going to produce energy, fossil fuels, no Nord Stream pipeline. We're going to rearm. We're going to have 2%. We're going to meet the 2%. Everybody should. And it was no green anti-American boilerplate. I wish our own president would emulate that speech. And so Putin now he's befuddled, he's confused, but it doesn't erase the point that he has the ability and the potential to crush Ukraine if he puts all of his resources there. And that's what he's going to be doing in the next week.
You know, unlike Russia, China still seeks to be known as a legitimate or respected leader. You know, Putin plays a rather brutal blunt game. It's really just to coerce through energy and military. But China wants to be seen as the leader in our region. It wants to change the norms and the standards in the region. You can't do that just by material power alone. So by now aligning with such an unpopular country and leader like Russia and Putin, that has set the Chinese plan backwards. You know, China can't just start bombing Taiwan. That won't achieve its aims. It has to take Taiwan, and it has to get other countries to accept its ownership over Taiwan and its leadership more broadly. So the Chinese now will be thinking, how do we do that? And so the silver lining, if there is one, from our part of the world, it certainly has set back China's plans, and I think we bought ourselves some time.